Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Neuroscience Computational, Monday, July 6. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Here's a thing you'll notice if you spend an afternoon reading the current literature in computational neuroscience, and it's the kind of thing that a casual scan of the science pages would sail right past. The most interesting work being done right now isn't primarily about the brain. It's about the relationship between scales of description, between the single neuron and the population it belongs to, between the microscopic wiring of synapses and the macroscopic weather of activity that sweeps across a cortex, between a biological system and an artificial one that suspiciously seems to organize itself along recognizable lines. The field has quietly stopped asking, "What does this neuron do?" and started asking, "How do the levels talk to each other?" And that shift from objects to the translation between objects is the single most important thing happening in the domain, even though almost no one outside it would phrase it that way. Let me make that concrete, because it's easy to say levels of description and sound like a philosopher waving his hands. Consider the very ordinary-seeming problem of taking a recording from thousands of neurons in a hippocampus and asking what the animal was doing. You run a dimensionality reduction. You squash all that activity down into a 2- or 3-dimensional shape and hope the geometry of that shape tells you something. And here's the humbling part. If you throw in every neuron you recorded, the shape often collapses into mush. The relevant structure, say, a 2-dimensional map of the physical space the animal was exploring, only reappears once you first filter down to the neurons that actually care about position. In other words, the population-level picture depends on getting the single neuron question right first. You cannot understand the crowd without understanding who's in it. That's why there's now serious energy going into tools that refuse to pick a level, that hold single neuron selectivity, population geometry, and network structure inside one workflow, so you can move between them without translating between 3 incompatible file formats and 2 warring research traditions. And once you start looking for this cross-scale ambition, you see it everywhere in the current work, wearing different costumes. There's the deep mathematical strand, people using tools borrowed from free probability theory to derive, in closed form, how variance distributes itself across the principal components of a recurrent network with messy, non-normal, biologically plausible connectivity. That sounds arcane. What it actually does is connect the microscopic statistics of who wires to whom to the macroscopic shape of the activity you'd measure. Same bridge. There's mean field theory showing how a single knob adaptation, the tendency of a neuron to tire after firing, can walk an entire network through 4 qualitatively different regimes, from frozen coherence through irregular oscillation to a global rhythm. Again, a local property, a global consequence, and the equations that carry you from one to the other. And there's the connectomics-inspired work asking whether fine-grained motifs, correlated pairs of synaptic couplings that the new synaptic resolution maps are revealing, can produce macroscopic dynamics that the standard, statistically bland models simply cannot generate. The suspicion, increasingly supported, is that the microscale details we used to average away are precisely where the interesting computation hides. Now here's the twist that makes this a genuinely strange moment. The same conceptual machinery is being pointed at large language models. There's an effort to take the internal features of these artificial systems and organize them into what are frankly borrowed from neuroscience functional parcels, a cognitive hierarchy, systems that predict the model's behavior and its failures. And they find something reproducible, partly conserved across different models. Sit with that. The intellectual apparatus we built to understand biological cognition across scales turns out to be portable to systems that were never biological at all. That either tells you something deep about how any information processing system must organize itself under pressure, a theme that surfaces in work on self-organization, where components survive precisely as long as something else is using their output, or it tells you we're pattern matching our own methods onto a mirror. Which of those it is not yet settled, and that unsettledness is exactly where the field is alive. So where does the domain stand? It stands at a moment of methodological maturity that hasn't quite become theoretical consensus. The tools are consolidating unified toolkits for attractor networks, for cross-scale analysis, for personalizing whole brain models without shipping anyone's private neuroimaging data around. The mathematics is getting sharper. The willingness to move between the neuron, the network, and the mind is at an all-time high. What's missing, and this is the argument I want to build over our next two conversations, is a principled account of when a level of description is the right one, and when insisting on a single level is quietly lying to you. Because the recurring lesson, from hippocampal maps to language models to the geometry of stimulus codes, is that stability and meaning live at different scales for different questions. Getting the scale wrong doesn't give you a slightly worse answer. It gives you mush. So let's hold on to that and follow where it leads. There's a temptation, whenever you survey a season's worth of research in a young field, to see nothing but a scattering, a paper on meditation here, one on chronic stress there, a study of chanting in a 5-year-old, a game-theoretic platform for morality, a toolkit for continuous attractor networks. It reads like a bazaar. But if you stand back and let your eyes unfocus a little, a current runs beneath all of it, and it moves in one direction. The deep current is this. The field is quietly abandoning the single neuron as its unit of explanation and replacing it with geometry, the shape that populations of neurons trace out as they compute. Consider what people now find worth measuring. Not the firing rate of a cell, but the distance structure among representations. There's a lovely notion emerging that we might call geometric stability, the question of whether the pairwise distances between how a brain represents different stimuli reproduce reliably across independent observations. And crucially, the argument is that this is a separate axis from the older ideas we cared about. It's not the same as whether a population's centroid stays put over days, and it's not the same as whether you can decode behavior from the activity. It's a third thing. A code can be temporally unstable and yet geometrically faithful, or decode beautifully while its internal relational structure drifts. That is a genuinely new coordinate to think in, and its arrival tells you the field has stopped asking, "What does this neuron mean?" and started asking, "What is the shape of the space these neurons live in, and is that shape trustworthy?" Watch how the same instinct surfaces everywhere else. When you build a toolkit to move between the single neuron, population, and network levels, and you discover that filtering by selectivity restores a two-dimensional spatial embedding that had collapsed when you threw in every neuron indiscriminately, you are making a geometric claim. You are saying the manifold is there, but it's obscured by cells that don't participate in it, and the real object of study is the manifold, not the census of cells. When another group builds an entire apparatus around continuous attractor networks, the canonical account of how the brain encodes position, head direction, movement, and insists that the missing piece is a standardized path, from spike trains to attractor geometry, they are naming the same destination. The spikes are raw material. The geometry is the explanation, and this is where the current deepens rather than merely widens, because the theorists are supplying the reason the geometry looks the way it does. If you want to know how variance distributes itself across the principal components of a recurrent network, which is just to ask what shape the cloud of activity takes, you find yourself deriving the spectrum of a covariance matrix for non-normal random dynamics, using tools borrowed from free probability. The point is not the mathematics for its own sake. The point is that the shape of population activity is now something you can predict from the statistics of the connections. Push further, and you find fine-scale synaptic motifs, correlated pairs of couplings, now visible thanks to connectomics at synaptic resolution, being tied directly to macroscopic, heterogeneous population dynamics, in ways the older canonical circuit models simply could not produce. Microscale structure to macroscale shape. That is the bridge everyone is trying to build from both ends. Then adaptation enters, and the geometry starts to move. Add firing rate-driven adaptation to a low-rank recurrent network, and you get a whole procession of dynamical regimes, a static coherent state, oscillations that slide from regular to irregular, stochastic switching between symmetric wells, a global limit cycle, two instability mechanisms, and a reduced three-dimensional model that captures the essential bifurcations. 3 dimensions, that is the tell. The high-dimensional network turns out to be legible in a low-dimensional shape, and the transitions between behaviors are transitions in that shape. Notice, finally, that this way of thinking is escaping biology altogether. The impulse to organize a large language model's internal features into functional parcels, arrange them into a hierarchy, and check whether that organization is conserved across models. That is cognitive neuroscience applied to a machine, and it works only because we've learned to treat representation as a structured space rather than a list of units. And when meditation gets reframed as a change in the brain's functional signal-to-noise ratio, with deepening practice nudging global activity toward a critical regime, you are watching a subjective, ancient practice recast as a shift in the geometry and thermodynamics of a dynamical system. So the noise, the apparent scatter, is real. But underneath it, the field is converging on a single conviction, that computation lives in the shape of collective activity, that this shape is set by structure and reshaped by adaptation, and that our task is to see it clearly. Hold that thought, because it raises the sharpest question of all, whether the shape we recover is the shape the brain is actually using, or merely the one our instruments prefer. That is where we turn next. If you have been with me through the earlier parts of this conversation, you will have noticed a curious symmetry running underneath a very diverse set of papers. On the surface, we have toolkits for continuous attractor networks, mean field theories of oscillating recurrent networks, a framework for mapping the cognitive organization of large language models, a proposal about meditation and the brain's signal-to-noise ratio. These do not obviously belong in the same room. And yet, if you step back, they are all reaching, each in its own dialect, toward the same difficult ambition to move fluently between levels of description, between the single neuron and the population, between the synapse and the macroscopic dynamic, between the mechanism and the meaning. So let me spend our remaining time on what that reaching implies and on what I would watch for next. The first implication is that the field is quietly conceding that no single level of analysis is sovereign. For a long time, there was an implicit hierarchy of respectability, with the biophysical detail of the individual cell at the bottom, honest and grubby, and the elegant abstractions of population geometry floating somewhere above it. What we are now seeing is a refusal to privilege either. A toolkit that unifies selectivity testing, dimensionality reduction, and network analysis in one workflow is making a philosophical claim disguised as software engineering. It is saying that the question of what a single neuron cares about and the question of how the population folds its activity into a low-dimensional shape are not two questions. They are one question observed from two distances. And the striking empirical detail there, that filtering by selectivity restored a two-dimensional spatial embedding which had collapsed when all neurons were thrown in together, is a small parable. The structure was always present. It was obscured by including everything indiscriminately, which is to say, the right abstraction is not the one that keeps the most data. It is the one that keeps the most relevant data. That word, relevant, is the second thread I want you to hold. Notice how many of these efforts converge on functional relevance as the organizing principle. There is the proposal that components in an adaptive system persist precisely as long as their outputs are used by other components, survival by service. There is the meditation account, where signal is defined as the variance that tracks the goal-relevant causes of sensory input, and everything else is noise to be decluttered. There is the geometric stability work, insisting that the reliability that matters is not whether the population sits in the same place across days, but whether the distances between things are preserved. In each case, the criterion of what counts as real or stable or worth keeping is defined by use, by consequence, by what downstream machinery can actually read. This is a subtle but profound reorientation. It means the brain's code is not a fixed object we decrypt, but a relationship between a producer and a consumer of signals. The third implication is the one I find most provocative, and it concerns the traffic now running in both directions between neuroscience and artificial systems. For years, the arrow pointed one way, borrow from the brain to build machines. Now we have a cognitive neuroscience-inspired framework being turned around and applied to a large language model, parceling its internal features into functional regions, asking whether those regions form a stable and partly conserved organization across models. Whatever you make of the specifics, the gesture is remarkable. It treats the artificial network as a genuine object of natural science, something with an anatomy to be discovered rather than merely a specification to be read off the blueprints. And it suggests that the conceptual tools we sharpened on Cortex may be our best hope for interpreting systems we ourselves built but do not understand. So what should you watch for? I would watch for the mathematics of non-normality and low-rank structure and second-order synaptic motifs to keep eroding the comfortable linear normal assumptions that underpin so much of our intuition, because that is where the surprises live, where microscale wiring quietly dictates macroscale behavior in ways the canonical models cannot express. I would watch whether the personalization through model sharing idea, keeping the individual's data on the individual's machine, becomes the template for a neuroscience that is both collaborative and privacy-respecting, because the ethics and the utility there are inseparable. And I would watch, above all, whether these cross-scale toolkits actually get adopted, or whether they join the graveyard of well-intentioned unifications that everyone praises and no one uses. Because in the end, the deepest signal ahead is not a result. It is a change of temperament, a field learning to hold several scales in mind at once and to let relevance, rather than resolution, decide what matters. Thank you for listening. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.